JOMOCast listeners, Hover would love to find a domain name for your passion. They'll automatically take 10% off your first order at the checkout using promo code JOMOCast. My name is Christina Crook, and I am the author of The Joy of Missing Out. I want to welcome you to the JOMOCast, a brand new podcast for founders and creators seeking joy in a digital age. JOMO is the joy of missing out on the right things. Life-taking things like toxic hustle, comparison, disconnection, and digital drain in order to make space for life-giving commitments that bring us peace, love, meaning, and joy. Welcome to the JOMOCast. I want to first thank all the patrons who have signed up over the last little while at patreon.com/JOMOCast. You guys are amazing, and you're making this podcast and the growth of this podcast possible. Thank you also to all of you who have written in and told us that you're enjoying the podcast and for sharing it and reviewing it as well. All of that makes this work go further. So thank you for that. Today, I am excited to introduce you all to an individual who is creating a technology company that is a bit unusual, a little bit like our friend Salima Ibrahim last episode. Joe Hollier is the co-founder of the Light Phone, a phone that's designed to be used as little as possible. I traveled to Brooklyn to meet with him in the new lab. It's inside a historic naval yard in Brooklyn, and inside of that incredible, airy space is a vibrant startup ecosystem. And we sat down for a conversation about technology, skateboarding, and what happens when we leave our phone at home. I hope you enjoy it. I am sitting with Joe Hollier at the new lab. Can you describe for our listeners where we are?
Yeah, we're inside of the Brooklyn Navy Yard. It's, it was a historic Navy Yard where they built some of the first ships here. I think the USS Arizona was built in this actual space. And it was kind of dilapidated in the last decade or two. And the city has kind of been rejuvenating the whole Navy Yard, but this space in particular. And so they started a kind of design-centric, hardware-oriented co-working space, but it's does a good job of curating and providing us with different prototyping tools that are unique to the new lab, and then, sort of bringing through different investors and connecting people in different ways. So it's definitely an exciting space, especially for, New York City, which never really had the booming tech scene.
Isn't it the Valley and then New York? And I've actually heard Toronto now is sort of emerging as a tech hub as well.
Yeah, I've definitely heard that about Toronto. And I mean, it exists in lots of cities. I don't think it's particular to those, but I think, we're definitely seeing it grow out. I mean, it's just so expensive in San Francisco. It's like, and the internet makes it possible to work essentially from anywhere. So, a lot of my friends that started startups, it's like Detroit or Austin. So,
yeah, the mobility is definitely possible. Thank you, Internet. So Joe is the co-founder of a company called the Light Phone, and it is a phone that's designed to be used as little as possible. Can you take us on the journey to how the Light Phone came to exist?
For sure. So back in September of 2014, Kaiwei, my co-founder, and I, we had not met yet. We joined this sort of Google experiment. It was here in New York City, and it was positioned for designers. And their hypothesis was, what if we gave designers some guidance and resource, introduced them to different thought leaders or founders, investors? Would they be able to create this vision for new types of startups that, through prototyping and sort of, creating the vision, faking it, they could inspire the investors and engineers to actually build the companies, because that's kind of how Google worked internally. The creative lab would come up with some wild idea, imagine it, and then the engineers could then try to execute it. So that was their hypothesis. I kind of joined as I think more of a wild card to the rest of the designers.
Because what was your background?
I studied traditional graphic design here in New York City at the School of Visual Arts, but I sort of dabbled with fine art. I was having art shows, but also stop motion animation, just sort of the mix of, mediums, photo, video, painting and collaging and stuff like that. But definitely nothing too tech heavy, using cameras and things like that, but nothing like, I had no ambitions to make a smartphone app. So when I joined this program, it was sort of so open-ended that I was curious enough, and it was, subsidized heavily from Google. So I was like, okay, nothing to lose. I'll try this. The first few weeks of the program, we're meeting all of these founders, and it's exciting. You're like, wow, they started this thing, and this guy. But I did see a trend quite quickly of, there was a kind of business model that they were really. I mean, it was almost the only way they wanted you to go forward, which was find something that's sticky, that people will use often. And if you have something that's sticky, addictive, how many hours a day does someone use it, then you can, make it free. It will scale. You can collect data, sell ads to monetize it, and then, wrap this pretty little bow on top that's going to make the world a better place by solving some, problem that they probably created or, at least made up. And so I saw that and I kind of said, oh, wow, I made a mistake by joining this program. The last thing the world needs is a smartphone app. If I were to make a smartphone app, it'd be to get off the smartphone. And in that kind of like joke with myself and Kaiwei, we said, oh, well, what would that look like? And we started to think of AOL Instant Messenger, which was, I guess, when I was sort of first introduced to the internet. And I remember that the internet lived in one computer. It wasn't in my pocket all the time. I had one computer in my dad's little study. And when I went on that, I could, maybe aim with my friends. But when I left the computer, I left the internet behind. And there was a much more conscious divide. And I thought, how could we encourage people to put up an away message? I think the smartphones kind of so ubiquitously just came into our lives. It was like overnight we went from, that separation to like now I check email before I wake up and get out of my bed and brush my teeth.
Right.
So I said, how can I encourage people to step away? And I think as an artist and a skateboarder, like I'd go out skateboarding, I would never bring my phone because I didn't want to break it. And they were like the greatest days away. And I think I thought it had so much to do with skateboarding. And as I thought about it, I was like, actually being away from the phone is probably a big chunk of why it was so refreshing. And I was like, how could I encourage people to leave their phone? And, we thought about this sort of, other phone, like a simple phone, your second phone, that you could leave your smartphone at home. It would become this kind of answer machine. If someone calls, hey, Joe's on his light phone, and if I wanted them to get through, they could reach me. And so we started with that idea by giving people flip phones and trying to test it. So we gave a few friends some flip phones and asked them for the weekend to try it out. And, people described their initial anxiety with trying it, like I was tapping my pockets constantly. I was bored. And then there was always this kind of like turning point where they just forgot and sort of stopped caring. I used to joke like they crossed the wall of FOMO. They no longer were thinking about what they might be missing out on because they had gotten distracted by the real world and they were present. And, they described the relief that brought them. But when we looked at the phone history, they told us about this experience. No one had actually made any calls.
Interesting.
So no one actually used the phone. And that's actually where that philosophy designed to be used as little as possible came from. We said, the value of our phone is not doing anything. And the less it does, the more potentially valuable it would be. So that was kind of the design lens or philosophy, so to speak, that we kind of ran every decision through. From the form factor, it's like, how can we make it as invisible as possible? Will people carry credit cards and an ID almost universally, my mom to my little brother? So it was like, okay, that's an interesting form factor. There's always going to be a place to stick it, whether it's your wallet or a backpack, or if you're going to the beach, you probably will have somewhere for it so it wouldn't be intrusive. And then the way that the screen kind of lights up so that when it's off, it looks completely blank. It's like all about being as visible as possible, obviously in functionality. The phone only makes phone calls. We limited it to 9 speed dials. And so these are all sort of intentional decisions that made you not want to use the phone. And the idea was that you would go light, you'd have that peace of mind that, God forbid, someone could reach you, but it was really about forgetting that it even existed. And that was kind of how the light phone came to be.
That's so interesting because I think, in my own experience, that having the ability for someone to call me as a parent, for example, my kids don't have phones. My kids are very young, but for my partner to be able to reach me for some sort of family issue is the primary reason why I would bring it with me. The other one is Google Maps, which you may probably have heard before. That is the one, the sort of the one thing that holds me to it, again, because it's sort of a safety thing. But it's interesting that is probably the primary reason. In fact, it sounds like you've seen the data that that's the reason why primarily people bring it with them.
Yeah, I mean, that's, why you don't just leave the house with no phone. What if there's an emergency, but then an hour later, your, partner gets up to go to the bathroom and you're unconsciously scrolling away without even thinking. So yeah, we bring it because of this one reason, the what if, but we find ourselves not actually using it in that way.
Explain. Okay, so I want to hear the rest of your story. And then I want to hear about the functionality of the actual phone, because I want
the
one.
lack of functionality.
The lack of functionality, but exactly but in terms of like how it pairs with your smartphone and all that. So, okay, so you're doing this program. What's it called again? The Google.
It was called 30 Weeks. Yeah, I don't know if I said that. And so it was basically like a school year long, September through May.
Okay, so and
30 weeks.
You and Kaiwei connect, and you start getting.
Kaiwei, I should mention, his background was in making phones or working in large teams that produce phones, and he had done that for I think almost 10 years, and then had quit that life because he felt like the companies he was working for were just kind of on a tech spec race, and they weren't designing phones because with users in mind, with actual humans in mind. He felt like, he wasn't connected with the products he was working on. So he actually went back to school, got his second master's at IIT, I always say ITT, IIT in Chicago for human-centered design. And it was right after that program that he had joined this Google incubator with me. And so it was kind of a perfect match in that he had this experience of how phones got made, but also this human-centered design perspective. So, the light phone just was so aligned with where his head was at. And I, of course, probably could have never pulled this off without him. So we went through the program, and we'd be pitching, essentially a piece of plastic that I got made. I went down to Canal Street, had them trace my credit card on a sheet of plastic and cut them out for me. And then I would use a sewing needle and fake where there might be speaker holes or something. And then Photoshop would, fake it lighting up. And we had this little presentation, and we'd pitch it to the different investors and stuff. It was a lot of great feedback, but something that really struck me was how polarizing the idea was. I mean, some people would come and it was like, wow, this is great, but other people really didn't like it. And that extreme polarizing, like no one really seemed bored. There was no one that was just like, oh, whatever. People had a really strong opinion. And as an artist, I was like, okay, this is interesting. There's some friction and tension. And, we're talking not just about technology, but, art, how we spend our time on the weekend. And it got much deeper and almost existential quickly. So it was checking all of my personal boxes of, yes, interesting. And of course, the idea of actually trying to pull this off just seemed so fun to the naive idea. So we were pitching it. And then at the end of the program, we sort of reached this point where, investors weren't going to just give us money to make this thing. It was so sort of out of left field from, where their portfolios of mostly smartphone apps that do exactly the opposite of the light phone, the retention model and everything. So they're just kind of like, well, who would ever, like, interesting idea, but I don't know. And so we went to Kickstarter and we launched the Kickstarter campaign. That was May of 2015. And to our surprise, it kind of went viral. I mean, we didn't have any experience launching anything. And to see the press sort of grab onto that conversation, because it was that, people weren't just unanimously loving it. It was, why would I ever pay $100 for a phone that does nothing? And it was like, now we're talking. This is an interesting question. Why would you? And, maybe not initially, but I think in simmering on that idea, people did come around to like, wow, I can actually understand. And, maybe they didn't buy the light phone, but at least our product, the idea of our product was able to touch them in some way. So as an artist, I was like, wow, this is a super powerful idea to create products that kind of have ideas in them. And once you put a price tag on it, people will have an opinion.
Right.
Whereas like if I made a painting about smartphone addiction, it's like people might just say, well, I don't do art. I don't, you kind of limit yourself. But everyone consumes,
right?
At least in this country. That was really interesting. And then the Kickstarter went well. We raised, I think, $400,000, and then went on to, try the roller coaster of getting the phone made. It required a lot more than $400,000. We had to get private investors, and even getting a factory on board was kind of a stretch, because they're like, interesting idea, but it seems too niche, and there is a risk for them to take on a partner like us. If we never hit a real mass production, they probably won't actually see any tangible profits.
Right.
So, even finding a factory that was willing to take us on was kind of intimidating. We're like, oh wow, we just got rejected from 20 factories. You thought if you had money, they'd want to make it, but that's not necessarily.
I would never have taken that into consideration. So who ended up saying yes?
Foxconn, which is basically the biggest electronics maker. They make almost everything: Xbox, PlayStation, iPhones.
Wow. So they are the ones manufacturing the iPhone.
Yeah. They manufacture it, and they actually even are like an investor. So we met one of the VPs there, and, he personally resonated with the idea. He was like, email is ruining my life. Like, I need this product. And I think that was the difference was, there were already small phones that existed. There's all sorts of weird phones when you go out to Shenzhen in China, like phones in the shape of toy cars and anything you can imagine. So it wasn't like a radically new technology, but yet the way we positioned it in the story we kind of told, none of these phones were getting the press that we had gotten, the international press. And I think Kai and I were surprised just by how far-reaching the demographic was. I think I sort of naively thought it'd be other Joes of the world, younger-ish creative types that probably work a lot on the computer and, maybe make music or write, and would use this as like a creative time tool. But, we saw older CEOs that were like, I can't even concentrate anymore. My secretary used to field all things, but now I bring my smartphone and it's like, I'm just getting blown up all day. Or, even like kids in college were like, I can't concentrate on my papers. I want this. And I, never would have thought a college student would want a phone with less. So it was pretty inspiring to see just how wide the reaction was.
Right. That's so exciting. Do you feel like part of why it went viral was because of your abilities as an artist? Because visually, all of the graphics and all of the video that you have that I've been able to see online is incredibly inspiring and not what you would typically see, in those spaces. So
I would hope so a little bit.
Yeah.
I mean, it definitely all came from the heart. All the photos were photos I took with film cameras while testing the idea, either with the flip phone or no phone, just not even having a light phone.
Right.
But like really getting into the headspace and, we're artists and humans first before a business. I mean, we're learning now that you need to be somewhat of a business to try to stay alive and sustain. But I would hope that genuineness translated in some way through the words or images.
Yeah.
But I mean,
it was definitely
a conversation. But I also think, 4.5 years ago this was now, or 4 years ago, I guess. Oh man, almost 5. The conversation around smartphones was different then. Some people had just gotten their first smartphone and, weren't, it wasn't quite as obvious, the side effects. Whereas today, I mean, the conversations,
it's everywhere.
Any newspaper you open,
Yeah.
There might be something touching upon one angle, whether it's, the social aspect of what it's doing to our conversations and empathy and our kids and their ability to talk to each other, or like, privacy, security and Facebook, or lack of focus and attention, or, our physical health, our eyes, our neck. There's kind of like an angle for everyone, the environment and throwing away your phone every year. It's like there's so many angles that there's something that kind of everyone is aware of, at least now. So that's been exciting to see that happen over the last 4 years.
Absolutely. It doesn't feel like it's as necessary or even necessary at all anymore to educate people on the negative impacts of the smartphone. Now it's a conversation about what's next. What do we do next? Mm-hmm. Yeah. What do you think we need to do next?
I mean, we don't try to pretend that we're the answer to the the dilemma of technology balance by any means. And, using a light phone is one perhaps step in a more holistic approach, but it's not like a magic pill that you buy a light phone and now you're no longer vulnerable to the tactics of the internet and smartphones and social media. But we wanted to create an alternative so that, maybe it's a relatively niche market of people that don't want a smartphone, but there isn't really anything serving them. We just felt like all the tech monopolies were getting more and more powerful, swallowing up any independent voice that was trying to do anything perhaps a little different. And it was all moving in this one direction, more and more connectedness. And we thought, could being more connected possibly make us any happier? Like, could spending another hour on a different new app, like, really make us any happier? So, we just wanted to try to create an alternative as well as like a way for people to step back and rethink and just kind of be like, all right, let's step back and soberly think about where maybe we would want to step forward. And, it's not necessarily less tech, perhaps. I think it's probably more a matter of like smarter tech, or maybe smart's the wrong word because everything's smart these days. More respectful tech, a more intentional tech. How can tech serve us versus, enslave us into these phone zombie scroll holes.
This episode is brought to you by Hover.com. Everyone's got their thing. My thing is the joy of missing out, and Hover's is the joy of free domain registration privacy. Hover is an incredible company, actually based here in Canada, which is where I live, and I use Hover for all of my domain registration, and I have for years and years. I'm thrilled that they are here on board with the JOMOCast in the very first season. And as a listener, you can go to hover.com/JOMOCast to get your next great idea registered in a domain at Hover. So thank you to Hover for sponsoring season 1 of the JOMOCast. I have a couple of thoughts. Right away, when you said the word connectedness, I reacted to it because that word has begun to lack any meaning in terms of what it means to be truly connected. And I recently came across, someone else had described being online less about being connected as it is about making contact. And I really liked that definition because it is a place to make contact, but it isn't actually a place to truly connect. I hear stories all the time about, they would call it, I would connect with someone online, but what they really mean is like
tweeted,
contacted someone. I made contact with someone online, but it only actually begins to have any value or a meaning once they take that contact and connect with them in real time, in real space and time. So just to say that, and also this idea of what I'm hearing you say, and what it seems to me that you're doing with the light phone is actually you're adding in more friction. I don't know if this is something that you're talking about here within the New Lab space and this conversation in terms of building more technology, but I'm hearing more and more about adding in friction. Can we talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, totally. And I think that's kind of where I was trying to say, like, we're not an answer to your problems. Every startup comes out, we're the answer to all of your problems. We're going to make your life, painless, this, that, whatever. Whereas the light phone, we're going to make your life a little bit more difficult. And not just because you might have to figure out where you're going on your own, but even on a very like personal existential level, when you first try the light phone, and I still feel this having, used my light phone for years now, there's an anxiety and, sort of existential question of what am I doing with my day? What am I doing with my life? You really can go there, and those thoughts can be, quite daunting, especially if you're so used to avoiding them by being like, well, whatever, I'll just react to this feed instead of taking the responsibility to actually own my day, kind of just used to giving it away. So it's like a series of questions. It's not even an answer. And in that regard, it's making your life more difficult, perhaps simpler, but that's not necessarily easy.
Right.
It's a difference. So yeah, we definitely like that friction. And I think in that friction, it proves that we are selling something. I think if you just see the product, perhaps maybe you're like, do I really need that? Am I really addicted? But when you take it away and you feel that anxiety, you're like, oh, wow, like this is an actual experience. And we've always said we're selling an experience, it's not really about the product itself. The product is almost like a pet rock, in my opinion. It kind of makes it special. You can kind of show off this thing and feel proud, almost your talisman that you've gone light, but it's the experience that has all the value. And I think the friction proves that it's real. And then, hopefully there is some resolve to that friction. But some users, the friction was so much that, they ran back to the smartphone and never wanted to try the light phone again. So, it's a balance.
Right. It's definitely not a neutral thing. Like you were saying, it's polarizing. But I think anytime we come into that place of having an extreme reaction, there's some sort of disturbance that's trying to get our attention, right? And it seems like that's what you're doing with the light phone, which is extremely exciting. Where are you guys at now? I know didn't you do another Kickstarter campaign? So tell me a little bit about that.
So we, began shipping the light phone in 2017. That was like the original one. And it was very much positioned as a secondary phone, your phone away from phone. And along the way, we met all these other users that had already kind of ditched their smartphone, and they loved everything that we were speaking about as a brand. But yet, the light phone wasn't what they needed. They were already sort of living a light lifestyle. They weren't on a smartphone, but they had these pretty crappy flip phones, and they were unsophisticated, and they made life more. They weren't designed with any sort of, actual intentionality. And we've the smartphones have elevated that design of user experience. So we started thinking about making a second version of the phone that was potentially a replacement of the smartphone, that was more of a tool, less of just a pet rock sort of conversation starter, more of something that you could, if you wanted, fully ditch your smartphone. I think the other side of that was the users that were using the light phone a lot, they became convinced that they were not wanting to ever go back to their smartphone. They're like, I would love to use this as my only phone, but the bank sends me a text with a PIN, it gets really complicated. So that's why the original iPhone, we never positioned it as an only phone. So we saw that there was a market for a sort of better, simple, full-fledged feature phone. And that's what the Light Phone 2 is. And it's not actually a replacement of the Light Phone 1. We are planning to continue making both side by side. But the new one basically brings texting. It has an e-ink screen, and then we're calling it a toolbox. So we're going to explore what other sort of tools we can make, similar to what apps on a smartphone might be, but very intentional. They'd be black and white, typographic based, and it would, all be with serving the user in mind. So maybe that's ride sharing, whether it's Lyft or Uber, being able to call a ride home. Is that a distraction? Is that going, are you going to just check Uber prices while you're sitting at dinner? It's like, it's more of a tool in that way, or a calculator, an alarm clock, even just something as simple as an alarm clock. Like maybe this is your bedside phone only, and you don't go light at all during your day, but you at least don't bring your smartphone to the bedroom or something like that. So that's kind of where we're at. We launched the Light Phone 2 crowdfunding campaign again in March 1st, actually almost a year ago, of last year, 2018, and we're pretty far along with the development of that. We're starting to fully test it internally, and we'll be launching those to our backers starting late June.
Very exciting.
So Light Phone 2 is coming, and that's been really exciting because...
Go get them. Can people still...
It's available for pre-order. Lightphone2.com would take you right to the Indiegogo, but lightphone.com would have, all of our links about both of the phones. We're sold out of the original one, trying to get supplies to keep making those as well. But it's exciting, yeah. Mm-hmm. And like I said, now in 2019, we're at such a different place. There was a delete Facebook movement last year, and the scandals have just escalated, and the problems are being felt by more and more people. People emails, I'm so fed up with this thing. And so it's exciting. I think finally it feels right, where for so long we've just seemed like this underdog niche weird idea. Now it's like, oh, there's actually some degree of market for it. Apple came out with that screen time feature, and I think that, at least to like a lot of investors or potential partners, was like a sign of, oh wow, this is a real thing, not just some artful kid who like doesn't want to be on a phone because he's emo or something. It's like there's an actual need. And when people saw that metric of like, oh wow, I spent 4.5 hours on my phone yesterday, I mean, there's a little bit of a wake up call, I think, for some people. So that's all exciting to me, because that's the conversation we're trying to have.
100%. I think that is probably the most powerful thing that I've experienced with other people, is when they do figure out how to look at their screen time usage, or even go into their battery and look like a 10-day, outlook on their top, where they're spending their time. It's enough to start creating change. So it is exciting to see those types of changes.
And change, I don't think, has to mean buying a light phone.
Right.
Like, we are always encouraging people, like, just try deleting the social media apps. You'd be so surprised of how big of a difference that'll make. But on the other side of that, we've done a lot of testing. And sometimes if you take out the social media apps, then I find myself checking my email religiously. Okay, then I take off the email. Now I'm Googling weird things just because. And so for me, it was like, once I really cut it out and sort of forgot about it all and really only had messaging, call, and maybe, maps or something, that's when I was like, okay, now I actually feel free.
Right. So a light phone and a good book can help replace
totally
those
or a friend.
Or a friend. Have you ever heard this quote, "We are not going to solve the technology problem with more technology"? Have you ever heard that?
Not maybe that exact quote, but definitely an idea I'm familiar with. And, there's a lot of irony in the light phone, in that we're making a phone to help people get off their phones. It's beyond ironic in many ways. And I mean, the quote does ring true in many ways, even though we'd be really hypocritical in that. But our new technology is trying to be less technology. So it is an interesting kind of question.
It's something that I come up against all the time. I mean, I'm doing an interview right now with Condé Nast Spain, and they often or always will ask, isn't it ironic that I found you through social media? And the reality is, yes, of course that is, right? Or even for me to find a bit of information about the light phone, or you personally, or any of that, right, online. The reality is it's a tool. And I love that is how you're describing the light phone too, as a toolbox. If it's used as a tool, if it's used well, it can be an incredibly powerful tool, obviously. But when we're thinking about it as something other than that, when it's serving a need that it wasn't created to meet, I think that's when we get into the problem of overuse.
Yeah, because I don't think the problem with too much tech is, or the answer is to go to no tech completely, because, I mean, it's amazing that we could even launch this light phone project on a crowdfunding platform that could reach people all around the world. Like, that is something unique to, our era right now. And that's incredibly powerful. I mean, I know lots of artists that have made books because of that, and done projects and met their, future wives and husbands. And there is something to that contact,
right,
and that can become a genuine connection. But right now, I think it's so tainted by the sort of toxic business models of the big players, that it's just, their interests are not aligned with ours. And if that's the case, then it can't ever really make us happy. So I would say maybe the answer to too much tech is better tech, smarter tech.
Absolutely.
More respectful. I think, if the business model changes so that it, they're incentivized to serve us, then I think that's a pretty good start.
Yes, agreed. Two last things I want to talk with you about. This is the JOMOCast. We're talking about the joy of missing out. What does the joy of missing out mean to you? And maybe kind of connected to that is, what do you think we should be missing out on culturally? Like, what is the big thing that you're trying to get maybe yourself or others to miss out on?
I don't know. I think for me, coming from a sort of art background, and, naturally making lots of visual things, social media seems like it, something especially like Instagram that would just be, heaven for me. Like, I get to share all these things I make, but it turned out to be kind of a toxic relationship with it, sort of very ego driven and narcissistic in many ways, and, wanting to prove versus actually like sharing because you're sharing. And so I think for me, like taking that out of my work when I'm working, like not trying to think how it might live in some, if every activity you're doing, you're thinking about how you're going to like post it and what someone might think, you're not really living for yourself. You're living to like create this illusion that you're going to share. And, that's ultimately never going to satisfy you. And so I think for me, the joy of missing out is really being with myself, for better or worse, because, it's not necessarily an easy thing to do, but I think that's when I am genuinely happy and make the best work. So yeah, I think it's like getting away from the social media for me and, just not caring, like, the news is so clickbaity and, over sensationalized these days that it's like just reading it. Sometimes it's like you could throw off your whole day and, not sort of participating in that wrestling match.
Right.
Because, critical news, like when things really happen, like you'll hear about it in real life. If you're out and about, like you will hear about it. I don't need to get the notification 25,000 times a day.
I can absolutely attest that that's true. When I was offline for 31 days, I mean, the big stories, people are talking about them. The excuse that you need to be reading news every day or every minute because you need to know what's happening is actually such a fallacy.
And when you step back, you realize like nothing actually happened. They're just turning and skewing and, it's like, you're like, whoa, I didn't actually miss anything. And that's like maybe the joy of missing out is realizing that you're not actually missing out.
That's the trick. In your experience as a founder, so this is a podcast for founders and creatives, primarily. My friend Cherry Rose Tan, she's a multiple time founder out of Toronto. She says, as founders, this is how she describes the founder experience. She says, we begin with passion, but we learn hustle and we learn fear and we learn grind. Has that been your experience as a founder?
Oh, completely. Yeah, it started with naive passion. I fell in love with this idea of this little stupid phone and I wanted nothing more than to make it. And then starting in, the Kickstarter was a big turning point. I was like, oh man, now I have this ticking clock of I owe people phones and I have to figure it out. And that was incredibly daunting, fear that I've never even experienced, feeling responsible for these other people's money. And then the roller coaster of running a business and even the day in and day out, it's like, I fantasized what it would be like to be designing the phone, but I didn't realize that there'd be 10 hours of emails before and after that almost every day. I think just the sheer volume of work was beyond what you could have ever predicted. And I don't really like to work like that. I've never had a formal job. My freelance life was, let me just barely make enough money to pay the rent and then have, fun is free for me. It's like when you can create fun, it's like I didn't need a lot of money. So money was never my motivation. So then it reached this point of like, why am I doing this? You almost start to question, but it's that underlying passion that I think takes you through when you're like, oh, this thing is sinking, the ship is done. How can I possibly pull this together? And I would actually also say like having a co-founder has been like one of the best things because it is such a roller coaster to have someone there for the highs to cheers, man. Wow, we did it. And then, the opposite when it's like, oh God, we're in the lifeboat, and to have, someone to lean on with and connect. Cause even, some of my closest friends, it's hard for them to truly empathize with me, to understand what it's like to go through that roller coaster. Just to have someone that feels it the way you do is, I don't know how I could have done it without that. So thank you, Kaiwei.
What brings you most joy? If you could spend your time any way you want, or when you do have free time, doesn't sound like you have a lot, but when you do, like, what are the things that are really restorative and life-giving for you?
I fortunately do take a lot of time. I think it's in our DNA as Light Phone. And I think it's funny that our investors love that I, won't answer their email on the weekend because I'm not on my computer. I'm out with no phone, roaming with my camera. But I think
So it's like photography?
Yeah, it's like I have so many little hobbies, like playing piano, painting, sitting with my cat. But I think it's those moments of like appreciation when I'm, not thinking about where I could be, when I'm just like, actually this moment, this sunset in here in my apartment with my cat on my lap, like listening to a record, it's like, this is everything I could have ever wanted. And when you're able to feel that and not be thinking, oh man, so-and-so is there, I wish that, or I wish I was here, or what should I do next? It's so easy to get in that train of thought. And when you're able to just sit and be, whether that's sitting at the park under a tree and you're just like, ah, or like walking the Williamsburg Bridge and you like look at the city and you're like, man, I live here. This is crazy. I always dreamed of living in New York City, and now here I am. I'm a 28-year-old man now. Well, this is, to like, process some of those things. I think that would probably be my moments of most joy.
That's beautiful. Joe, thank you so much for being with me today.
My pleasure. That was fun.
Well, thank you for listening. You can learn more about our guests in the show notes and by visiting JOMOCast.com. The JOMOCast is edited and produced by Thomas J. Inge. Musician and composer by day, podcast ninja by night. Special thanks to writer Rebecca Wigand, musician Peter Katz, and educator Adam Kaplan for their practical and moral support creating this season of the podcast. The JOMOcast is listener supported. When you sign up as a patron at patreon.com/JOMOcast, you'll get access to mini bonus episodes with me and digital sociologist Dr. Jess Purium. Plus, we'll send you a JOMO Manifesto letterpress print, stickers, and a handwritten card in the mail because I believe in the power of the personal. Plus, snail mail is just one of the most joyful things on earth. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate and review it on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you subscribe. And a 5-star review would be spectacular. Do you want more JOMO? Go to experiencejomo.com to sign up for a free week of JOMO quests to get you started on your journey. As always, remember, there is joy missing out on the right things. I'm your host, Christina Crook. Thanks for listening.